So today we are going to be going over the third feast, first fruits. The Hebrew name is Reshit, which means the start of. And first fruits is the start of a 2-month spring harvest. And it sounds a lot like the first book of the Bible, Breshit, which means in the beginning. Many of the Jewish books of the Bible are named just from the way they begin. So in the Hebrew Bible, it's Breshit for Genesis instead of Genesis, in the beginning. But Reshit means the start of, and this is the first fruits, the start of the spring harvest. Then we're going to be talking, once we get through with that feast, we're going to move to the life of Christ and talk about 2 stages of observation. Two stages. One is the stage of observation, and one is the other stage is the stage of interrogation. And it won't make much sense until I teach it, but it's important to know. And then if there's any time left over, I wanted to talk about some Hebrew words that are common in Messianic congregations. So for the Feast of First Fruits, we're going to talk about the biblical practice and the Jewish observance and the Messianic significance of Reshit. So the biblical practice is really pretty straightforward. Let's look in Leviticus 23. Verses 9 through 14. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb a year old without defect, together with its grain offerings, 2/10 of an ephah, and the finest flour mixed with olive oil. A food offering presented to the Lord, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering, 1/4 of a hin of wine. You must not eat any of the bread or roasted or the new grain until the very day you bring this offering to your God. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come wherever you live." So it was a 1-day feast acknowledging God's bounty and that God's harvest, his bounty, belongs to him and not the Israelites. And like I said, it started a 2-month spring harvest. So that was, as in many of these feasts, what starts off as being pretty straightforward and simple in Leviticus ends up much more detailed with the Jewish observance. So, the Jewish observance, I have up here Thursday, the 14th of Nisan, and I want to make sure I say this so that everybody will understand that depending upon the calendar year, the Friday of Nisan might be the 14th or the 13th or the 17th because the calendar changes, but Passover is always on Friday. Sabbath is always on Saturday. So on the year that Jesus died, it was Friday the 15th, Saturday the 16th, Sunday the 17th, Thursday the 14th. So, on Thursday the 14th, to review the slaughter of the lambs. Like we talked last time, that in preparation for the Passover, each able-bodied man, and the Passover was a travel feast, so every able-bodied man was supposed to come back to Jerusalem for that feast. And now, if he could bring his family, fine, but they were not obligated, but he was obligated to come back. So on the 14th around noon, they started slaughtering lambs. And it had changed from the Egyptian Passover, which was celebrated by the man of the house slaughtering the lamb, cooking the lamb, doing everything himself. It was like an individual thing for family. They would pick out the lamb on the 10th, they would examine it to make sure it was without spot or blemish, and then on the 14th, they would slaughter the lamb, and then when sundown came, and Thursday the 14th turned into Friday the 15th, then they would roast the lamb and put the blood on the doorpost and celebrate Passover. But by the time we get to Herod's temple, it had become much more elaborate, and the priests were doing the sacrificing. I mean, the individual Israelite would bring his lamb, and he actually had to slit the throat, but from that point on, the priest caught the blood in the bowl, they passed it all up to the bronze altar, put the blood at the base of the bronze altar, bowl back, hung it up on hooks, gutted it, skinned it, gave it to the Israelite, and then he took it home to roast and to cook for the Passover meal. So that happens on the 14th. From the 14th, from noon until sundown, 275,000 lambs were prepared in that way for the Passover. Okay, we all got that? Now, even though it was before sundown on the 14th, the high priest and a contingent from the Sanhedrin would walk out of the temple, and they would go up to the side of the Mount of Olives to the barley harvest, find a field where the barley harvest was, and they would stake out what they call it, which I just learned, a shock of barley. So that when you take a bunch of barley and you don't cut it, but you just gather it up and tie it up so it's coming out the top, that's called a shock of barley. So they would mark 3 shocks of barley and tie it with a ribbon around it and do nothing else, and then they would go back to the temple. Sundown came, they all celebrated Passover. So the 15th was Pesach, or Passover. Passover starts when the sun goes down because the night precedes the day. So night, day, Passover, Passover. Jesus was crucified during this day from 9 o'clock in the morning till noon. It was the wrath of man. And at 9 o'clock in the morning, when they were when the cross is on the ground and they're nailing him to that cross at the temple, the high priest is offering the Hagigah offering, the offering of one lamb for the whole nation. And of course, that was pictured by Christ, who would be offered as the Lamb of God for the whole nation. And then from 9 to noon, you have the wrath of man, and you have different groups going by and saying, if you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. And he said he would destroy this temple in 3 days, and he can't even come down from the cross. And they were gambling and dividing up his clothes and all those types of things. But then from noon to 3, we have darkness coming over the whole earth. And that is the wrath of God. And that for those 3 hours, Peter tells us that Jesus became sin on our behalf. And for the first time and only time in all of history, that God the Father had to turn his back on God the Son because he cannot tolerate sin, and Jesus became sin. And all the sins of the whole world, past, present, and future, were put upon Jesus during those 3 hours. He dies. But before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus go to Pontius Pilate, request his body, come back, get his body down, hurriedly wrap it for burial, put it in the tomb before sundown, before the Sabbath. Then the Sabbath comes, Sabbath, and that starts, and Saturday started the day of the festival of unleavened bread. So that's why the Passover was fulfilled by the death of Christ. The festival of unleavened bread was fulfilled by the sinlessness of his sacrifice. So as the sun sets on the Sabbath, Saturday turns into Sunday. And they can do work now because the Sabbath is over. So the high priest and his contingent from the Sanhedrin leave the temple again, go up the side of the Mount of Olives again, back to where they had staked out those 3 shocks of barley. And they're joined by thousands of pilgrims for the feast. It's a big deal. They march up there, they're singing songs, and the high priest asks 5 questions to the crowd, just in general. And he says, has the sun gone down? And they would answer, yes, the sun has gone down. Secondly, will you harvest the barley? Yes, we will harvest the barley. Third, with these sickles? And the crowd would answer, yes, with these sickles. And there were 3 baskets that were brought up, and he would say, in these baskets? And they would say, yes, in these baskets. And lastly, the high priest would say, shall we harvest? And the thousands would chant, yes, harvest. So then they would harvest the barley, put them in the baskets, take them back to the procession would go back to the temple through the court of the women. But then when the priest went through the Nicanor gate, Long I, like Nicanor gate, the people could not follow them into the temple, so they stayed in the court of the women. So what happened this night? The next morning, they are going to celebrate this festival. So they would winnow at night with torches, lamps, whatever, all night, as long as it took. They first would winnow the barley. They would throw it up and separate the wheat from the chaff. Then they would roast it and mill it. And with olive oil and frankincense, they would bake it with leaven. The feast, I'm sorry, no leaven, because it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But they would bake it. They would bake it and have it all ready. So the next morning at the temple, then the high priest, people once again, a lot of, the court of the women could hold 6,000 people. So I don't know, if there was, that many, or there was overflow out into the courtyard there. But he would come out and he would be in his back would be the bronze altar. People would be standing in front of him, and he would lift up the bread and shake it in all four directions, meaning that God was in control of the harvest in every direction all over the world. Acknowledging God's provision and sovereignty over all the earth. Now, a really important component at that point was faith, because this was just the first fruits of the barley harvest. And if God accepted that, then it was the first fruits of more to come. You know, in theory, God could send a hurricane, hail, disease, and wipe out the harvest for that year. So they had to have faith that these first fruits of the barley harvest was the first of more to come.